Hello, everyone. This is Steve Hill from New Hydrogen, and I'm joined today by Dr. Naomi Bonis from Stanford University. And she has a wealth of experience we're going to talk about in just a second. But welcome, Naomi. I'm glad to have you here.
Oh, it's nice to be here, Steve. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Dr. Bonis is currently the managing director at the Stanford Natural Gas Initiative, the co-managing director at the Stanford Hydrogen Initiative, and an advisor to several startups in the energy field with a wealth of experience in the realm of sustainable energy. Your experience precedes yourself. I've seen you in different, as I mentioned before, I've seen you on the stage and I've seen podcasts with you, and you have a great wealth of knowledge. And so I'm super excited to talk with you today a little about the topic. And actually, our audience is varied that will watch this podcast. And so I thought we'd start with kind of the basics. One of the cool things that I noticed that you had done was co-designed a class at Stanford on the hydrogen economy. And that's a topic that seems to be gaining a lot of interest lately. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts for those who are just kind of looking into this hydrogen field. They're hearing the buzz, they're seeing government investments, they're seeing investments in general pouring into this field. Why should they care, or what's the big deal with hydrogen?
Well, I think, it's a great question, Steve. I think in general, people should really care about energy, right? Because that's what drives economic growth. It's what allows us to have the quality of lives that we do. And with that said, in the next few decades, hydrogen is going to make up probably about 18% of our total energy use. And I think, with increasing energy costs, concern for climate change, the average person should be excited to know that there are solutions out there like hydrogen that are affordable, safe, and good for the planet. So at its crux, I think, hydrogen has sort of come forward as the primary contender to fill this gap in decarbonization strategies, because as we move to electrify more and more with wind and solar, out in, let's say, 2050, 50% of our energy mix will still be fuels. So oil, biofuels, ethanol, hydrogen. And we need to find solutions for those fuels and that don't have carbon in them. So that's kind of the reason that I'm so excited about hydrogen. And I think to say, it has a lot of potential applications in lots of different sectors. And that makes it really exciting as well, because when we think about the types of fuels that we're replacing, they're used in so many parts of our daily lives.
I love that you brought that up, because the applications for hydrogen are a lot more than I would have imagined first hearing about hydrogen. It goes beyond some of the basics that we think about into some of these hard to abate sectors that most people don't think about. The big industries like steel, oil and gas, glassmaking, pharmaceuticals, all of these industries use a lot of non-renewable energy currently, and there is an opportunity to move into that market, I think. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, where's the best place to start with all of this?
Yeah, I think, we already have a lot of momentum in transportation. And there's some, reasons for that. I think, particularly in places like California, where there are transportation policies in place that have driven the markets, right? So in California, we have the low carbon fuel standard. It gives energy providers $100 to $200 per ton of CO2 abated by using alternatives to, gasoline and diesel, essentially at its core. And so, within that space, hydrogen has already started to be utilized, I think, for applications like long haul trucking, where, it's not clear to me that batteries are going to get there in the time frame that we need, right? We've got policies in California now that are calling for low carbon vehicles by 2035. And batteries are heavy and they take up space within these trucks, and truckers don't want to stop for 8 hours and charge. So hydrogen is a really good alternative and has already been used in that capacity for a long time. So that's one application. I think the others are, within transportation, particularly aviation. We're seeing a lot of movement in that space too. Planes, again, are not going to fly on batteries anytime soon. They're also not going to fly on pure hydrogen. But what we can do is make sustainable aviation fuel and blend it in with the jet fuel to reduce the overall carbon footprint. And hydrogen is used in the making of sustainable aviation fuel. So I think transportation is probably going to be the first sector that we see a lot of movement in. But to your point, the real promise of hydrogen is across these heavy industries. You mentioned steel, for example, right? Currently, we use fuels both in the power and heat production that's necessary for steel, but also in the reduction process, the actual chemical process of making steel itself. And it turns out that basically anywhere where you use hydrocarbons, you can use hydrogen. I mean, if we look at natural gas, right, 4 out of the 5 atoms are hydrogen already. So it's a really natural extension. And so, any application where you use natural gas or coal, you can think about using hydrogen. And these applications where there aren't other alternatives on the table are really exciting, right? I think it's less exciting to think about hydrogen, being burned in a power plant to make electricity, because we have other options on the table at most places to do that. But I think we're going to see lots and lots of applications come out of the woodwork for hydrogen.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the global scale too, I have experience living on a Caribbean island in the Dominican Republic for a couple of years, and diesel power was the way things went in that island. So I can tell you the thought of having an independent power source, which we can talk about in a second, that doesn't rely on diesel power. The power is always going off at random times of the day, right? And they just had to. And this kind of idea where in Dominican Republic's not alone, many island nations, and then there's other places, talk to Germany and France and other places right now with their natural gas situation. It's not pretty because of the conflict that's happening in Ukraine. And so we have these kind of supply chain issues and abundance of these natural materials. We're lucky in the United States, of course, that we have a lot of natural materials at our fingertips, but it's not the case worldwide. And so it's exciting to hear about these applications, even though that particular sector may not be the one that gets everybody all excited. The other one is, oh, sorry, you're going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I did want to say, whilst I don't think that we should necessarily, be using hydrogen that we make in that capacity, I do think, to your point, we've got an increasing number of climate events every year, right? Last year there was, 20 plus $1 billion climate events in the US alone, right? And we need to figure out a way to build resilience into our systems. And as we move to higher and higher shares of wind and solar, we're seeing, the strain on the grid, because in places like California, when we have wildfires, the solar output goes all the way down, but everybody wants their AC on, so the demand goes up. And hydrogen, much like natural gas, could provide, this resilience, because we could make it from the curtailed wind and solar when we have lots of it in the summer, in the middle of the day, and we could use it at times when we don't have that wind and solar available. So I did want to make it clear that I was, I think that using it in that capacity is really, an exciting application.
Yeah, okay. All of the areas are exciting to me because the potential is unlimited for us to be able to. The thought of burning hydrogen and having your only emission is water is just such an interesting concept that's been sort of a dream for so long, and yet I feel like we're kind of reaching this level where technology and investment are peaking together, and we're starting to see really amazing things happen. And this is an exciting time to be alive, really. In the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see some really incredible advancements, I think. And I'm super excited about that. So all the areas are great.
Yeah.
And and that actually maybe is a good time to talk about. I was just thinking about this idea of energy autonomy or independence. I read something recently about some of the Arab nations before oil came to be, were a lot of them not really affluent areas. And obviously we know that now that's changed with the advent of oil. But I think about some of the other nations of the world that don't have these resources. How could something like a localized hydrogen production, a green hydrogen production, change things worldwide in that sense?
Yeah, I think about these questions a lot too, right? We live in a world where we still have close to 1 billion people without electricity. These are big problems that we need to solve. And one of the really exciting things I think about hydrogen is, a lot about energy is created in a very centralized fashion, right? So it's made in huge volumes and then it's transported by various means all over the world. And I think, as you were alluding to, renewables are sort of changing the way that we think about energy in general. So in places like Africa, we're not seeing big electric grids the way that we have here. We're seeing more microgrids, and we're seeing the installation of small community solar, and hydrogen, particularly when it's generated from renewable resources, kind of fits in really nicely with this idea of small scale, decentralized solutions that don't require huge capital investments up front, are easy to maintain, provide reliability because there isn't, a big system with lots of moving pieces to deal with. So I'm pretty excited about sort of this idea of hydrogen in a decentralized energy system scenario.
Well, that's great. I agree with you 100%. And maybe switching gears a little bit, I was just thinking about kind of the future of this hydrogen as we talk about how it can change the world. And right now, 99% of hydrogen produced today is made from fossil fuels, like natural gas, coal, and oil. These methods are cheaper than producing green hydrogen, if we've talked about before, but they come at a cost to the environment. What do you see in the future with this change, or the prevalence of hydrogen production methods, and how they will impact the future?
Yeah, no, I think, it's a really good point. And so currently, we make hydrogen from steam methane reforming, mostly of natural gas. Some places around the world coal, but here at home, natural gas. And let's say, on average, it's about $1 per kilogram to produce that. If we look at, green hydrogen, and I really hate the color scheme, by the way, but that's a whole topic. Okay. If we think about green hydrogen, so we're using solar and wind to electricity to split water, we're somewhere in the $5 to $8 per kilogram. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act has hydrogen production incentives that really level the playing field, right? So for low carbon pathways, you're going to get an additional $3 per kilogram back. But it's still sort of not quite competitive with the existing methods. And so, and I also think we have a shortage of green electrons, period, right? We need to increase our grid by 60%. And I mean, Lord help anyone trying to get a transmission line put in across the country, right? It's impossible. I mean, it's really challenging. So, the other option I think about a lot is actually in the near term, making hydrogen from natural gas and using carbon capture and storage. To put carbon capture and storage on a steam methane reforming plant is only about 20 cents per kilogram, which makes it economically attractive. And, you can take advantage of credits like 45Q that give you $85 per ton for the CO2 that you store. And I really try and think about, how do we get this hydrogen economy off the ground, period? And it's going to take all flavors. If you look at the IEA's recent report on hydrogen, out in 2050, 50% of the hydrogen will be made from renewable electricity, and 50% of the hydrogen will be made from steam methane reforming with carbon capture and storage. Both of these are, lower carbon pathways than what we have today. We shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And quite frankly, getting low carbon hydrogen markets established should be priority one for everyone, regardless of what flavor. So I think working together, right? I don't see there being, a conflict between, I'm going to say the colors, green and blue. But I do think in the near term, the lower cost of blue hydrogen will help establish some of the markets, because they'll be able to produce it at scale in a way that green won't. But green will fill this other need, I think, as the markets develop, where we can produce it locally, where we can avoid having to transport the hydrogen around, because whilst the production is expensive, we know how to do it. Moving hydrogen around is really the sticky wicket in the whole equation, right? It is really challenging. It's the lightest molecule on the planet, and it likes to escape. It likes to move through metal. I mean, we've got our work cut out figuring out how to do that. So I think both of these colors will play a role, but in the near term, I think that it's going to be blue hydrogen that really kind of scales up faster and establishes the markets.
Yeah, you mentioned the economics of it all, right? It really gets down to the cost, because if I'm a manufacturer and I'm reliant on, this is one of my feedstocks and this is one of my fixed costs, I want it as low as possible. And while I might have a huge heart and I want the good, I also have a bottom line and shareholders to address, and I've got to figure out how to balance those two things. And so the incentives help, right? But ultimately it's what's the cheapest. And so I think what you're saying is exactly right. For what we know from today's technology, it's got to be something incremental and incremental growth, right? That helps us progress towards that ultimate goal. But traction needs to be had. We need to start talking about it on a regular.
The other thing I'll say is, right, there is a cost associated with any pathway that has carbon emissions. And by the way, green hydrogen has carbon emissions too, right? When we make solar panels, it's not without carbon emissions, right? So, every pathway has carbon emissions, and we need to be really honest. And I think part of this cost equation that's so tricky is that we're talking about the cost to consumers today, but it's really hard to build in the long-term cost of mitigating climate change, right? So these, the number of billion-dollar climate events in the States has tripled since the 80s, right? That's a fact. And when we think about, using blue hydrogen, we're still releasing 4 kilograms of hydrogen for every 4 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen. And those 4 kilograms of CO2 will have an economic impact. It's just that it's out at a longer time frame, and it's hard for us to think about that, when we're modeling out the costs. But we recently wrote a paper about this, right? And it's hard to argue that green hydrogen, particularly when it's connected to the grid, right, and the grid is getting greener, is not going to be overall. It's going to be lower cost than blue hydrogen, because we're still going to have methane emissions and CO2 emissions associated with that pathway that will require us to invest in order to reduce that CO2.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to your new definition of how to categorize hydrogen production methods. Or maybe
Well,
you
I'm
have.
really excited because the IRA, right? They don't talk about the colors at all. This is like, I think, one of the best pieces of legislation that the DOE really got right in terms of not categorizing it, right? They talk about carbon intensity. Let's talk about that because, and quite frankly, there's going to be so many hybrid pathways that don't really fall under one color definition or another. It just gets confusing. So I think talking about carbon intensity is really where we should all be focused.
Good. Well, the lower the better, and we're all hoping for the innovations to come through. We're definitely working on that at our company at New Hydrogen as well. So excited to see how that future rolls forward. Um, on that note, you had mentioned, well, you'd mentioned the supply side and how we're ramping up supply side, and we're dialing that up. But one of the things I've noticed that's maybe not a popular subject to talk about, but that's the demand side. What is your thought on, right now it's sort of everybody's kind of waiting. It's the chicken and the egg game. Like, are we gonna, should we invest and then be kind of an early mover in this, or should we wait and watch, or how's this going to pan out? We don't really know. What needs to happen for the demand side to really ramp up?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think everybody is starting to realize this because there are so many hydrogen producers and not very many customers right now. There are a lot of wannabe customers, right? But the economics make it impossible for them to pull the trigger on moving to low carbon hydrogen. So I think, one of the things we can do is look back and at how the wind and solar industry really developed. And the reason that it really, got underway was when the renewable portfolio standards were put in place for the utilities, right? So the utilities were then required to have a certain percentage of renewable energy in their portfolios. And so, I think that's where we're headed for hydrogen. I know the DOE is really focused right now on thinking about the demand side of the equation. It's very clear to everyone that we need a little help there, whether it's a stick or a carrot. I think we don't know yet. But I can imagine, the two primary markets for hydrogen right now, right, in the US, 10 million metric tons a year go to refineries and fertilizers. So between them. So, you could imagine a scenario where refineries have to use a certain percentage of low carbon hydrogen, and that would spur the market to that sector. You could do the same for fertilizer. You could do the same for steel, right? And then it levels the playing field such that, one steel company that wants to be a good citizen is able to do so because they're not putting themselves at a disadvantage to the competition. So I think that's what we'll see, these demand incentives. And by the way, we did it for transportation, right? LCFS has driven the hydrogen economy for transportation. And it works really well. I mean, it's kind of a proven test case. So I think that's what we'll see. And I think we'll see it sooner rather than later. So that's really good news.
Well, I think those are excellent points, and I love your positive outlook for the future. I share the same enthusiasm. I think like I said before, I think we're on the cusp of something really great, and it's great minds that are coming together to really make this happen. And so I appreciate your contribution and your time today. Maybe just one final question before we wrap up. Yep. I was just thinking about the need. Obviously, we're a company who is innovating and creating technology that we hope will lower the cost of hydrogen. But there's a lot of companies out there. From an investor perspective, what would you say to investors who are kind of thinking about investing in the green hydrogen economy and they're weighing the pros and cons? Do you have any insight or any thoughts about that?
I think that once the demand incentives get put in place, this is going to move really, really quickly. And anyone who is slow to invest is going to regret it. I think that we're going to see hydrogen ramp up and take off in a similar way to what we saw for shale gas back in the early 2000s, right? Or wind and solar. It's going to there. I think there's no doubt, there's been billions of dollars poured into this by the federal government, by states. We've got the hydrogen hubs coming, and technology is the foundation for all of this. So, I think, and there is a big enough market share that I think there are no bad ideas right now when it comes to producing hydrogen. So investing in technology is going to be a sure bet. That's what I think.
I love it. I agree with you 100%. Naomi, thank you so much for your time today. Do you have any final comments? Anything you wanted to share?
I think, the one thing I will say is that I think people should really go out there and educate themselves about energy, because it really is the foundation for the lives that we lead. And we all have a role to play in this. And as we put in hydrogen infrastructure, it's going to impact communities. So even if your business isn't in energy, it's a part of your life, and we should all understand the pros and cons to all of these different pathways.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to maybe a conversation again in the future, or seeing you on stage at another conference. Thanks, Naomi.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.
Okay, have a good day.